When I was a teenager, I went on vacation with my family to Key West, Florida. Really, we were there to celebrate my cousin's high school graduation, but we took the opportunity to also go get in some rest and relaxation. Together, we visited gorgeous beaches and dined at some fantastic restaurants, and I even went parasailing for the very first time. Then, one day, we stumbled upon an interesting spot. A centuries-old brick building known as the Fort East Martello Museum. Despite it being built in the South, the fort was actually constructed and used by the Union Army during the American Civil War. Almost 200 years later, the fort is now owned by the Key West Art and Historical Society and is dedicated to preserving the rich history of the island and the people who live there. I remember being enthralled the second I stepped through the door. I gawked at an old-fashioned diving suit and Civil War relics they had on display, and, of course, being the art nerd that I am, I loved looking over paintings by local artists like Mario Sanchez and Robert Eugene Otto. While I was making my rounds through the museum, something caught my attention. Another part of Gene Otto's collection. A 3-foot-tall straw doll, sitting on a chair inside a glass case. It was dressed in a faded white sailor suit and held a tiny toy lion, or maybe it was a dog, and its decaying face stared back at me from behind the glass with beady black button eyes. Tacked up on the wall behind him, I found a collection of strange letters. Letters that told stories about car crashes and divorces and people losing their jobs. It didn't take me long to realize that every single one of these letters were all addressed to that eerie-looking doll, and they were all begging him to take away his curse. This is Legend Has It. I'm your host, Michael Walker, and the legends about Robert the Doll just might be true. Thomas Osgood Otto was born the son of one of the few doctors who lived in Key West in the late 1800s. Inspired by his father, he too went on to earn a degree in medicine, as well as opening up a series of pharmacies, and he married a Bahamian woman named Minnie Elizabeth Watkins. After they were married, their home on 412 Francis Street wasn't quiet for very long, as they would soon have a daughter named Mizpah, then their son Joseph, then Thomas Osgood Jr. Then they would move to their new home at 534 Eaton Street, where on October 25, 1900, they would welcome their son Robert Eugene Otto into the world. We don't know an awful lot about Gene's early years. He was a toddler, there's not really that much to tell. But what we do know is that in 1904, Minnie Otto returned home from a trip to visit family in Germany, and she brought back a present for little Gene. It was a 3-foot-tall straw doll dressed in a pink and green clown costume. Young Gene fell in love with that doll the second he laid eyes on it. He even gave it his first name, Robert, and from then on had everyone call him Gene. Since they were about the same size, Gene would dress Robert up in his own clothes. Robert's favorite outfit was Gene's sailor costume from when he was a toddler. Gene would take his doll everywhere with him. He would talk with it and play board games with it, and even save Robert a place at the family dinner table. And none of this would be all too alarming, except for the fact that Gene carried on like this for the next 14 years. And in those 14 years, Robert would, he would do things. The story of Robert the Doll has been told and retold a million times. I'm certainly not the first person to talk about him, but I do want to point out one thing that tends to get left out of most retellings of the story. The Otto house was full of people. Most ghost tours, books, and TV shows that feature Robert will only mention Gene and his parents, Thomas and Minnie, as well as a handful of paid servants. But remember, Gene had 3 siblings, Mizpah, Joseph, and Thomas. There's also William and Emmeline Abbott. William was a man who was hired to take care of Jean's grandfather, Joseph Otto, and when Joseph died, Jean's father hired William as a clerk at the pharmacy across the street from their home. The Abbotts will become important later on, but my point is there were a lot of people around to notice when Robert started talking. Residents of the Otto house claim to have heard voices coming from other rooms, distinct voices, as if two people were carrying on a conversation, but when they went to investigate, they would find Jean playing with Robert. Minnie and Thomas would even hear laughing coming from Jean's room hours after he was supposed to be asleep. But when they opened the door to their son's room, all they would find was Robert, sitting up in bed, next to a sleeping Jean. Even Jean's toys would be found broken, but none of the children would fess up to breaking them. Things would go missing or turn up in places they weren't supposed to be. The Otto family would come home to find that someone had dumped papers from Thomas's office all over the floor, or that personal belongings would be in odd places throughout the house. In a blazing fury, the Otto parents would interrogate the servants, but they would claim they hadn't done it. In later years, the Otto family would begin to find Robert in places where he hadn't been left. Sometimes they would even see him running past out of the corner of their eye. It's certainly an eerie narrative, given that it's true. See, we don't really have any documents directly saying any of these events happened. In fact, a lot of it is just rumor, scary stories, and snippets of half-truths whispered between the more superstitious islanders. That's the problem with urban legends. They act like a centuries-long game of telephone, steadily wearing away at the facts of a true event until you're left with whatever makes for the most compelling story. And that's not to say that nothing actually happened with Robert. There are definitely some weird stories about this doll, but those didn't really start to happen until Jean was a grown man. And I'm getting to that, don't worry. I'm just pointing out that we can't verify that these particular events did or didn't happen in the Otto home. But there is a small glimmer of truth in these old rumors. See, the children's toys would break, and things would go missing from time to time, and a lot of that can be chalked up to having a house with 4 children in it. As I'm sure any parent would attest, things are going to be hectic. Jean's older sister Mitzpah later wrote in her diary that when things went awry in the Otto household, they would gather their children together and ask them who was to blame, but none of the children would have any explanation. None, that is, except for Jean, who would simply point a finger at his companion and say matter-of-factly, "Robert did it." Jean loved art. The Otto family pharmacy just so happened to sell painting supplies, and Jean would practice with the paints they had available. As an adult, Jean would expand upon this passion. He and his brother Thomas left to attend the University of Virginia in 1921, where he studied architecture. He then spent 3 years at the Academy of Fine Arts in Chicago, and then 2.5 years at the Art Students League in New York, steadily refining his skills and building his repertoire as a painter. He would move to Paris to set up an artist studio and continue studying at Académie Julian and painting for the likes of Le Grand Chaumière and the Delacluse Academy. It was the idyllic lifestyle, and it would only get better when Jean met his future wife, Annette Parker. Anne had spent most of her life in the upper-class area of Boston and was accustomed to the finer things in life, where Jean excelled in art and excelled with music. She was an extremely talented pianist, and men would gather outside her apartment window for hours just to listen to her play. The two were married in Paris on May 3, 1930 at the American Cathedral. Not long after, the young couple moved to New York during the Great Depression, and since he couldn't really make a living off of his art during the time, Jean became a furniture salesman. Anne's career, on the other hand, would skyrocket. Under the stage name of Anne Gerard, she continued on as a popular pianist, co-writing over 30 songs with her husband. She even performed from time to time at the prestigious Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center. After days of reading up on the Otto family history, I have to tell you that I have a bit of a soft spot in my heart for Annette Parker Otto. She was brought up in a society that expected her to become nothing more than a child-rearing housewife. In fact, she was even sent to the Garland School of Homemaking, which taught young women how to cook, clean, and take care of a family. But Anne did so much more than that. She trained hard and became a successful musician. She was good at what she did, and she knew it, and so did everyone else. In spite of the odds and the difficulties set in her way, Anne spent a good several years in the spotlight, following her dreams. It's almost as if the fates wanted her to have one shining day in the sun before the storm clouds rolled in. But in 1945, Anne would have the rug pulled out from under her, and everything she had spent her entire life working towards would be lost. Jean's mother, Minnie, had taken ill, and they had to leave for Key West immediately. Minnie Otto left this world the night of September 14th, 1945. It was fairly peaceful. She simply closed her eyes and slipped away while lying in her bed, surrounded by her 4 children who she loved so dearly. The Otto estate was split amongst the 4 children, but since Jean and Anne were a young couple just starting out on their own, Jean's siblings all signed over their ownership of the house to them. And just like that, the Otto family home and everything in it was handed down to Jean and Anne. Everything, including Robert, who had been locked away in the attic for over 25 years. It wasn't long after they moved in that Jean went back to carrying around his old childhood companion. He would talk to the doll as if it were an actual person, telling him stories about his years in France and New York. Jean built a bed and furniture for Robert in the attic, and even bought the doll toys so the two could play games together. And it wasn't long before Robert really found his stride. Kids who would pass by the Otto home, now called the Artist House, claimed that they would see a short figure pulling the curtain aside and looking out of the windows in the attic. According to one story, an unnamed plumber was working in the attic while Robert was in the room. He heard a noise, kind of like a child's giggling, but when he looked behind him, no one was there. The man simply shrugged it off. Maybe he was just hearing things. He kept working, but then he heard the childish giggling again, so he turned back around, taking a careful look around the room. This time, he noticed something had changed. That peculiar doll in the white sailor's costume had somehow moved to the opposite side of the room. The plumber left immediately, leaving the job unfinished. I can't imagine any of this was easy for Anne to take in. She must have thought everyone around her, her in-laws, the plumber, the paid workers, the kids on the street, and even her own husband were all going insane. And it certainly didn't help that she was now living in her husband's shadow. Jean's popularity blew up the second he stepped foot back in Key West. All of a sudden, his artwork was being put on exhibitions all around Florida and New York. He was asked to help with fundraisers for local community groups, and was even asked to put his knowledge as an architect to use by redesigning old buildings around Key West. He amassed a large collection of paintings, and whatever he couldn't sell, he kept. When he died, he wanted the artist's house to be converted into a museum that would show his personal collection. Anne, in the meantime, put her dreams on the back burner in order to support her husband. She called on her training at the Garland School to become the perfect housewife, taking care of their house and baking her famous key lime pies for the benefits that Jean would help with. Anne never had another job as a pianist again. In fact, Jean directly forbade her from playing the piano in public. Maybe he was jealous of her rampant success in New York, or maybe the fame that he had garnered in Key West had gotten to his head. But whatever the case was, Jean seriously began to govern what Anne could and couldn't do. He forbade drinking in their house, and told Anne that she couldn't play piano at their church's worship services, although she desperately wanted to. One of the wildest requests he made was that whenever they went to an outing or a party together, Jean made Anne wait outside for a few minutes so that he could go in first. He didn't want to share the spotlight. He didn't want to be upstaged by his wife with a successful music career that rivaled his own pursuits as an artist. Jean did love his wife dearly, but it was his time to shine. Meanwhile, Anne was left to wither away, all the while being taunted by the rumors about the cursed doll living in her attic. I think now would be a good time to backtrack and toss around a few theories about Robert. See, for all the fanfare and attention that this doll has received over the years, No one can agree on what exactly would have caused him to come to life, and some of it is because there is a lot of misconception as to where Robert actually came from. In his book, Robert the Doll, The True Biography of Key West's Haunted Doll, author David Sloan theorizes that Jean's mother bought the doll while on a trip to Germany. We have records to indicate that Minnie was in Germany in 1904, and according to David's research, dolls that fit Robert's appearance were being made by the Steiff Company at the time. And yes, for you toy aficionados, that is the same Steiff Company that invented the teddy bear. Another popular theory was that Robert was bought by another Otto relative, usually Jean's grandfather Joseph, but this is unlikely as Joseph passed away 5 years before Jean was even born. Still, others say that the doll was given to Jean by a paid servant or the daughter of a servant, usually depicted as a young black girl, but unfortunately there's no names given in these accounts and no other proof to back up the claims. So, in 1904, Minnie Otto bought her son a toy while on a trip to Germany. That's a great start, but it still doesn't explain how or why Robert would have been able to move around. Maybe Jean's strong emotional connection to the doll somehow imbued it with sentience. A lonely little boy wanting so desperately for his imaginary friend to be real that he actually breathes life into it. Another theory that gets tossed around a lot is that the doll was voodooed, specifically by that nameless servant woman we mentioned earlier, but again there isn't much to support this idea. David Sloan posits another theory, however. Perhaps the doll is possessed by the spirit of a child. You remember earlier when I mentioned William and Emmeline Abbott? Well, census records show that sometime between 1900 and 1910, Emmeline gave birth to a child. We don't have records that say what year this happened, or the baby's gender, or even what its name was, but on the 1910 census, Emmeline Abbott listed that she had one deceased child. And I'm sure you can tell where I'm going with this. The Ottos and the Abbotts were very tight-knit. Given they were around the same age, Jean and Emmeline's child might have even been playmates. And if anything had happened to her child, be it a dire incident or a severe illness, who else might she turn to for help than the Ottos? Thomas was a doctor after all. Whatever it was that took Emmeline's child away from her very well could have taken place right in the Otto family's living room, next to a straw doll and a white sailor suit. And perhaps that child never actually left. Jean, unfortunately, developed Parkinson's disease later in life. Those that knew him say that in his final days, he spent most of his time in the attic, talking to Robert. He finally passed away on June 24, 1974, much to the dismay of the people of Key West. After the death of her husband, things only got worse for Anne. Jean didn't leave anything for Anne in his will, instead giving everything he owned to his sister Mizpah. Mizpah allowed Anne to sell the family home, and then Anne left for Massachusetts to spend the rest of her life living with her sister. And I'm sure you're wondering, well, what became of Robert? Well, the artist's house was sold to a woman named Myrtle Reuter and her husband, who had their own strange stories of the haunted doll. The Reuters would rent out rooms in the house, and one time they rented a room out to a man who was studying to become a lawyer before leaving on a short vacation. When they came back, the man had an incredible story for them. While the Reuters were gone, he claims that the doll somehow managed to lock him in the attic for several days, and also gave him yellow fever. Myrtle and her husband would hear strange voices and giggling, and even claimed to see Robert move. One day, the Reuters had finally had enough. August 18, 1994, Myrtle met with the assistant director of the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, looking to make a donation. She told him she had Jean Otto's doll, the famous Jean Otto who had dedicated years of his life to the city of Key West. She had a very valuable relic on her hands, and the director knew that. He genuinely sat her down and asked her if she wouldn't want to try selling the doll instead, but Myrtle took a firm stance and shook her head no. "The doll is haunted," she said. She just wanted to get rid of it. So Myrtle signed all of the necessary paperwork and left Robert in the museum, where he stayed in storage for several years. Through the efforts of some local ghost tours who sent tourists to go see the doll, the museum eventually put Robert on display in a glass case, where he remains today. And not too long after that, the letters started pouring in. See, there's another local legend about Robert the doll. He doesn't like having his picture taken, and people claim that anyone who takes his picture without asking permission will be cursed. People who have tried this have found that any photos they've taken after visiting Robert are damaged, or entire rolls of film have been ruined. They've experienced horrible natural disasters, car crashes, family deaths, lost their jobs and their homes, become terminally ill, lost their pets, had their identity stolen, and gotten divorced, just to name a few. And let me specify, it's not just one or two of these horrible events happening to these people, but several, often compounding on one another in a rapid succession, like a sick game of dominoes. The museum receives letters every year to this day from people begging to have Robert remove their curse. And, if they're lucky, he just might forgive them. But just to bring it all home, I do want to point out another interesting note from Mr. David Sloan. His book was a main source for the stories I've told you here today, and even then, there is a lot of Robert the Doll's history that he wasn't able to mention in this book. Mr. Sloan expressed to me in our interview that there were several mishaps during the course of his research. His laptop would break for absolutely no reason, or files would be deleted out of nowhere, and he told me he believes it's because there were some things that he found out that Robert doesn't want people to know. Those stories never made it into the finished book, and he refuses to tell anyone what they are. I have to admit, with all due respect to Mr. Sloan, I scoffed when I heard him tell me this story. At first, I might have believed it to be another spooky anecdote taped onto an already spooky story, in an attempt to make it all seem the more credible, or at the very least, more interesting. Mr. Sloan is the leader of a ghost tour in Key West. Telling scary stories is literally his job. And yet, I have written 6-episode scripts for this show. I've kept careful track of my research notes, my drafts, my sources cited, everything, storing them online and on my computer and on a flash drive. And so far, I've been able to keep up with all of the files without any hassle. Except for the script for this very episode. I've lost this script and had to rewrite it twice now, and I don't really have an explanation as to why those files may have disappeared, but it does give me pause. Maybe there is some truth to those old ghost stories, after all. The Legend Has It podcast is written, researched, and produced by me, Michael Walker, with editing and recording assistance by Nicole Tomplet. All of the music and sound effects are courtesy of freesound.com, and the links can be found in the episode description along with the sources cited. And now, time for a few shoutouts. I'd like to give a special thanks again to David Sloan, author of Robert the Doll, the true biography of Key West's haunted doll, my main source while writing this episode. I loved reading his book and I found it very informative, and I even had the opportunity to talk to him while doing research for this episode. I had a lot of fun discussing the history of Key West's spookiest resident, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to have collaborated with him. You can find a link to purchase his book in the description. Also, thank you to my buddy, author, filmmaker, and podcaster Nate Brislin, and the Association of Cryptozoological Fieldwork and Analysis Group on Facebook for giving the Legend Has It podcast a place to advertise our episodes. If you like this show, then you should definitely go check out the ACFA, where members share scientific articles, newspaper reports, sightings, and anything and everything pertaining to cryptozoology. Also, go check out some of the awesome projects Nate has worked on, like his film, The Pine State Phantoms, or his podcast, The Bizarre Base Broadcast, where Nate personally interviews fellow cryptozoologists. I cannot recommend this man's work enough, so go check him out. Links to the Facebook group and the Bizarre Base Broadcast will be in the description. And again, shout out to my friend Tristan for being a $1 monthly supporter over on Anchor Podcasts. Thanks, man. The support really does mean a lot to us. You guys can find our other episodes on YouTube, Anchor, and now on Spotify. And you can keep up with us on Instagram at Legend Has It Podcast. But you guys only get those updates if you do what you can to make sure they pop up in your feed. So shoot us some likes, subscribe to the channel, follow us on Instagram. Do what you gotta do so that we can keep telling you the scariest true ghost stories on the internet. You'll definitely want to stay tuned because I have a very special episode coming up. Together, you and I, dear listener, are going to take a walking tour of one of the most haunted cities in the United States. My hometown of Vicksburg. It's gonna be a good one, so stay tuned, and thanks for listening.